Welcome everyone. Today's story is one of the most shocking stories I have covered on this channel. But before we start, please comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is. Feel free to leave a like to the video as well. Thank you. Let's get to it. The snow fell heavy across Plainfield that November evening. Sheriff's deputies stumbled through the frozen fields toward a dimly lit farmhouse, still unsure what they were walking into. Inside, the air was thick with an unfamiliar odor, something between decay and damp earth. In the kitchen, the lantern light flickered across objects that did not belong in any home. One deputy froze before calling the others. Hanging from a crossbeam was what remained of Bernice Worden. The sheriff would later say it was the most horrifying thing he had ever seen. The house was silent except for the creak of the boards under their boots. Each room told a piece of a nightmare they could not yet understand. Articles of clothing that had been stitched from something unnatural, skulls converted into bowls, furniture covered in tan hides that were not from animals. Every corner revealed another detail that turned disbelief into sickness. Plainfield, Wisconsin, population barely 600, had never seen anything like it. Worden, a 58-year-old hardware store owner and mother, had vanished earlier that day. Her son, Frank Worden, returned to find blood on the floor and the cash register missing. He told investigators that one of the last sales recorded that morning was for antifreeze, sold to a man named Ed Gein. When police questioned neighbors, everyone knew exactly who Ed was. He lived alone on a rundown farm outside town. People described him as shy, awkward, and polite, a good handyman who helped with odd jobs. He seemed lonely but harmless. That faint sense of harmlessness was what led officers to approach his property with little caution. The barn door was unlocked, and the lights burned faintly through dust-coated windows. They expected to find stolen goods or evidence of robbery. What they uncovered was a place trapped between life and death. A farmhouse frozen in time, part museum, part tomb. The officers did not even realize yet that most of what they saw, the remains and the artifacts, were not all from Bernice Worden. Some pieces came from others, people long buried, taken from their graves in secret. After calling for backup, investigators moved carefully through the rooms. The sitting room was sealed with grime, filled with outdated furniture and yellowing newspapers stacked almost to the ceiling. In the corner, a shrine of sorts, preserved and untouched. Ed's mother's Bible, her rosary, and her chair, all arranged as though she might return any moment. Beyond that room, the house changed completely. Haphazard stacks of bones, jars filled with something pale, boxes labelled only with dates. The refrigerator contained nothing edible, just fragments no one could identify at first. It was impossible to separate the human from the domestic. The place looked less like a killer's lair and more like a workshop for ritual. When Sheriff Art Schley walked back out into the cold, he could not speak. Officers described the scene in broken sentences, trying to reconcile how a mild-mannered neighbor had created something so grotesque. As word spread, the people of Plainfield locked their doors for the first time in years. Some refused to believe the reports until they saw the newspapers. Others burned their junk mail rather than risk a stranger setting foot on their property. For a town where everyone knew each other, the discovery was like a betrayal. Who was this man the community had trusted? How could the soft-spoken farmhand who babysat local children have turned into the monster at the center of that house? To answer that question, police retraced Gein's steps. They interviewed townspeople who remembered seeing him at the hardware store just hours before Bernice disappeared. Witnesses said he seemed distracted, almost absent-minded, but polite as always. No one noticed the gun stored in his car or the receipts folded neatly in his jacket pocket, evidence that would seal his fate. By dawn, Ed Gein was in custody. He offered no resistance, just confusion that he was being arrested at all. During questioning, his composure disturbed everyone in the room. He spoke calmly, almost politely, about visiting graves, about his mother, about how everything he did had a reason, even if he could not explain it clearly. Detectives noticed that his eyes drifted when he talked about death, as if he were somewhere else entirely. In the hours that followed, teams worked through the property cataloging evidence. The list grew longer than any murder case in Wisconsin history. Dozens of human remains, preserved or reassembled, were found across multiple rooms. Some were crafted into masks, others into household items. Among the items catalogued were articles belonging to women long missing from the county, names once whispered as mysteries, now painfully resolved. Some evidence also pointed to abuse inflicted on victims before death, adding another layer of horror. Reporters arrived within days, turning the lonely farm into a media circus. To most of America, Ed Gein became a dark curiosity, a man whose acts defied even the vocabulary of crime. But for Plainfield, it was not distant horror. It was personal. The small town that once seemed sheltered from modern violence was now synonymous with madness. Whole families left town to escape the publicity. What the police uncovered that night was more than one murder scene. It was a window into a disturbed world, built from loneliness, loss, and delusion. Every item found hinted at a pattern, a man trying to bring something back that should have stayed gone. But before they could understand the why, investigators needed to understand the who. How had Ed Gein become this man on the edge of town, creating atrocities no one could imagine? To understand what they found inside that house, we need to go back decades, before Ed was even a killer. Long before the farmhouse on the edge of Plainfield became infamous, it stood as a simple structure, surrounded by swampy fields and open sky. It was rough land, 30 miles from anything that resembled a city. In the winter, silence covered everything except the wind pushing through broken fence lines. That stillness shaped the Gein family. It was all Ed ever knew. Edward Theodore Gein was born in 1906, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His arrival did not bring joy to the household. It reinforced Augusta's sense of duty, not affection. She had already decided that her children would be raised apart from what she believed was a poisoned world, one filled with sin and temptation. The family's isolation did not just happen. It was enforced. Augusta demanded it. The Geins moved to that 160-acre farm outside Plainfield when Ed was still a small boy. It was functional land, a few animals, some crops, and endless chores. There were no neighbors nearby, only an occasional traveler on the road into town. Augusta liked it that way. She could keep her children close, untouched by what she called corrupt influences. Every Sunday, and many nights in between, she would read from her worn family Bible, usually passages describing punishment, disobedience, and eternal suffering. To Ed, her voice was law. George, Ed's father, was a different story. He had once worked as a tanner and later ran a small grocery store before Augusta convinced him they needed the farm. By then, his drinking had worsened. He was rough around the edges, a frustrated man who resented his wife's dominance but lacked the strength to defy her. For the boys, especially Ed, their father was more an obstacle than a guide. He shouted, sometimes hit, but then disappeared into silence for days. Ed learned early that comfort came from pleasing his mother, not his father. Augusta's world revolved around judgment. In her eyes, women were a source of corruption. She would point to the young women in Plainfield who flirted or danced and call them fallen. She told her sons that all women, except herself, were instruments of evil, temptations meant to destroy men. Her words penetrated deeply. Ed listened, obedient and wide-eyed, convinced that her view of morality was absolute truth. Henry, the older brother, reacted differently. He was more independent, more skeptical of their mother's preaching. He took side jobs in town and made friends outside the farm. Where Ed retreated inward, Henry pushed back quietly. People later described him as good-natured but realistic, aware that his family was not normal. He worried about how attached Ed was to Augusta. He once confided to a friend that Ed's devotion to their mother was not healthy. School did not offer much reprieve for Ed. His classmates remembered him as shy and withdrawn, with an odd sense of humor that made others uncomfortable. He laughed at the wrong times, smiled when others were silent. Some stories claim he was bullied. Others say he just did not understand how to connect. He was not violent, just painfully strange. Teachers noted his cleanliness, his politeness, and the way he blushed when spoken to. Still, he kept to himself, spending evenings in the woods or helping his mother with chores. Augusta often forbade playdates or visits to nearby farms. Outsiders, she said, would taint them. Life on the Gein farm moved with the seasons, but never changed much. Days began before sunrise with milking, feeding hogs, cutting wood. Nights ended with scripture. The radio was rarely turned on, and books other than the Bible were scarce. On rare trips to town, Ed would stay close to his mother, watching how others seemed relaxed and careless in ways he could never be. He wanted to understand them, but could not. Back home, when he tried to talk about what he had seen, Augusta would lecture about sin and degradation until guilt replaced curiosity. In those years, Ed learned lessons that twisted ordinary facts of life. Death was not something to fear, it was a moral lesson. When an animal died, Augusta saw it as nature's judgment. When a neighbor passed away, she spoke about divine punishment. One childhood story, repeated in police interviews later, described the day Ed watched local hunters slaughter a hog. Most children would have been disturbed. For Ed, the sight of flesh exposed beneath skin left an impression that never faded. It was not horror. It was fascination mixed with reverence. He was growing in a perfect storm of emotional neglect, religious control, and social isolation. Psychologists later noted that every support system that might have corrected his worldview, school, friends, extended family, had been stripped away. His mother not only dictated what he thought, but also defined who he was. She told him he had been spared for a special purpose, to care for her, to stay pure, to reject the world's corruption. That belief would become the root of his delusion decades later. The farm's isolation meant that no one really saw what was happening within those walls. To outsiders, the Gein family was simply reclusive. They paid their taxes, sometimes sold produce, occasionally hired help. Inside, conversation revolved around guilt and repentance. Laughter was rare, affection almost non-existent. Augusta never hugged her sons. Instead, she corrected them. She corrected everything. When Ed reached his teenage years, he began reading medical magazines for the pictures. Anatomy fascinated him. He did not understand human relationships as others did. His mother's teachings had made them sinful. To him, the human body was something mysterious and forbidden, yet central to his thoughts. He felt both compelled and ashamed, emotions that would feed each other for years. By his 20s, the relationship between Augusta and her sons created tension. Henry wanted freedom and sometimes mocked Ed for his blind devotion. He told neighbors he worried about how much influence Augusta held. For Ed, criticism of his mother felt like blasphemy. He defended her fiercely, even when Henry's words were more concerned than cruel. Every disagreement ended the same way, with Augusta deciding whose faith was stronger. When George's drinking worsened, responsibility for the farm fell mainly on the boys. Augusta used that to reinforce dependence. She told them that together, with her guidance, they could survive anything. There were no celebrations, no visitors, no change. Only the rhythm of isolation repeating until time blurred. As adulthood approached, Ed remained emotionally childlike. He idolized his mother and saw her as the center of moral authority. The outside world frightened him, especially women who did not fit Augusta's ideals. Yet inside that fear was curiosity, a quiet conflict that would later turn deadly. Even then, some neighbors noticed odd details, the way Ed stared too long or laughed to himself while working. Most dismissed it as harmless eccentricity. In small towns, odd behavior rarely drew serious attention. Isolation has a way of intensifying what it shelters. On that farm, with miles of nothing surrounding him, Ed Gein's identity was being formed in a vacuum. Everything he knew about good and evil came from one woman's interpretation of scripture. Everything he felt for warmth or belonging came from her approval. When Augusta prayed aloud, Ed listened, as if God were speaking directly through her. As long as Augusta was alive, Ed had rules. But rules do not last forever. By the early 1940s, the Gein farm had become more a burden than a home. The soil grew thin, the livestock fewer, and the machinery older. George Gein, now in his 70s, spent most days drinking, offering little help. The tension between him and Augusta remained constant, filled with shouted scripture and silence. For Henry and Ed, every winter felt longer, every year smaller. Their lives revolved around survival and subservience. But change was coming, and it would come through loss. George was the first to go. In 1940, after years of heavy drinking, he collapsed during a bitter March morning. Ed and Henry carried him inside, but the old man never regained consciousness. Officially, the cause was heart failure related to alcoholism. There was no funeral service. Augusta refused anything she deemed worldly or unnecessary. Henry dug the grave himself on the frozen farmyard. To Ed, his father's death was sad, but not tragic. In later interviews, he mentioned it casually, almost kindly, as though George had simply outlived his usefulness. Psychiatrists would later say that the death removed the only weak barrier standing between Ed and his mother's total control. With George gone, the remaining three formed an uneasy triangle. Henry began to see the situation for what it was. He loved his mother, but felt suffocated by her moral rigidity and disgusted by her treatment of Ed. He started spending more time in town, socializing with people Augusta despised. He even dated a widow who lived nearby, something that outrageously defied his mother's view of morality. Ed stayed home, more devoted than ever. When neighbors asked after him, he would smile and say he was keeping house for Ma. Henry's frustration grew. He began confronting Augusta's sermons, telling her not everything in the world was wicked. To Ed, That sounded like betrayal. The brothers argued, sometimes violently. Still, they worked the farm together, dependent on each other for livelihood if not affection. In May of 1944, Plainfield's prairies were dry and hot. Farmers were burning brush to prepare for planting season, a common but risky practice. On one such day, Henry and Ed set a fire near their property line to clear marsh grass. The wind shifted unexpectedly, spreading flames across the dry field. By evening, smoke covered the horizon. Firefighters from Plainfield responded, but darkness forced them to stop. Henry was missing. When the fire finally burned out, the search began. Ed helped lead volunteers through the charred field, carrying a lantern. Later reports claimed he seemed strangely composed, even cheerful. After several hours, he told firefighters he thought he knew where Henry was. They followed him to a spot far from the burned area. There, they found Henry's body lying face down. His skin showed minor burns, but not enough to explain death. Investigators noted bruising on his head. The official report listed asphyxiation from smoke inhalation, but the bruises led some to suspect something else. Still, there was no autopsy and no further inquiry. The coroner's cause of death stood. Plainfield did not question tragedies for long. Whether accident or something darker, Henry's death left Ed and Augusta alone, exactly what she had always wanted and what he had always feared. From that day on, he acted as her full-time caretaker, addressing her as though she were divine. She, meanwhile, grew more frail but more commanding. Her control deepened rather than softened with age. A few months later, Augusta suffered a small stroke that paralyzed part of her body. Ed nursed her constantly, cooking, cleaning, reading scripture aloud at her bedside. He told doctors she was everything to him. When she recovered enough to walk, her bitterness grew sharper. She scolded him for minor mistakes, corrected his prayers, and reminded him daily that women were the root of all sin. Despite the cruelty, Ed adored her attention. She was the only person he had. Each insult bound him tighter to her approval. That same year, a neighbor named Smith invited Ed to his farm to buy straw. While there, Ed witnessed Smith beating a dog painfully while a woman screamed for him to stop. Later, Ed recounted the event not with empathy but fixation. He remembered the woman most, the way she pleaded, the sound of her voice. When he told Augusta about it, she erupted in anger, not at the cruelty toward the animal, but at the woman's presence. That woman was not married to that man, she told him. She lived in sin. That is why his soul is damned. Something in Ed's mind linked the two, the sinful woman and the notion of punishment. Her words became almost ritual to him. Within a year, Augusta's health declined again. Another stroke left her nearly helpless. Ed tended to her day and night, watching her fade. In later hospital interviews, he said those days were the best of his life. When Augusta finally died in December 1945, Ed's world simply stopped. There was no funeral procession, only a small service at the local cemetery. He rarely spoke during it, clutching his hat, staring at the casket as if waiting for her to speak again. Afterward, he returned to the farmhouse alone. Neighbors saw a light burning in her bedroom every night for weeks. Psychiatrists later suggested that this was the moment reality fractured for Ed Gein. Without his mother, there was no moral compass, no structure. Everything that had restrained him emotionally dissolved. He boarded up her rooms, sealing them like a shrine, a museum to the one person he could not live without. The rest of the house fell into decay, dust, rodents, clutter. The contrast between those preserved rooms and the rest of the farm symbolized the divide inside his mind. Reverence and ruin living side by side. Plainfield saw only a quiet man who shopped for necessities, did minor repairs, and kept to himself. Some pitied him, others thought him simple but kind. They did not see the isolation fermenting just beyond the flicker of his lamp. To them, Ed was the man who lent a hand without asking for money, who showed up at funerals alone, then vanished before the meal. They could not have known that each passing year after Augusta's death was eroding what little sanity he had left. In every tragedy that touched the Gein family, the pattern was the same. Someone died, and Ed retreated deeper into solitude. By 1945, he had no father, no brother, and no mother. Only memories and moral confusion stitched together in his head. That emptiness would eventually seek form, carving the path toward the horrors in his farmhouse. Plainfield saw a quiet man alone on a decaying farm. Inside, something else was evolving. After his mother's death, the farmhouse on the edge of Plainfield became a different kind of silence. For the first time in his life, Ed Gein woke to an empty kitchen. The absence of Augusta's footsteps was loud enough to echo. He still cooked breakfast for two, setting her plate on the table before realizing she was not coming back. Neighbors saw him less and less after that. The few who did said he looked smaller somehow, like the house itself was swallowing him. In the early years alone, Ed tried to keep up with chores. The fields went untended, but he patched roofs, fixed tools, and bartered for supplies in town. Money came from selling bits of the farm or odd jobs. He worked as a handyman for local families, shoveling snow, repairing fences, and babysitting children, while parents ran errands. Everyone called him dependable, if peculiar. He laughed at his own jokes and told strange stories, but people forgave his eccentricities. In Plainfield, help was help, no matter how odd the helper. Inside the farmhouse, reality was deteriorating. Ed closed off every room his mother had used, the parlor, her bedroom, even the sitting area where she read scripture. He nailed boards over the doors and hung blankets to block dust. Those rooms stayed as they were in 1945, perfectly frozen, her Bible open, her rosary still hanging, furniture arranged exactly as she left it. The rest of the house unraveled. Newspapers and magazines stacked in towers, dishes crusted over, and the smell of damp wood filled the air. He slept in a small caved-in corner near the kitchen stove where he could keep a fire going through winter. When visitors from town dropped by, he greeted them outside. No one entered after Augusta died. Plainfield did not gossip much about him. In rural towns, a recluse was easier to overlook than to understand. People assumed grief made him strange. When he came to town, he was polite, soft-spoken, sometimes awkward. He would sit in the tavern, nursing a single beer, or browse the hardware store like a man with nowhere else to be. Now and then he brought gifts, animal meat, vegetables, even venison out of season, and most folks looked the other way. Despite his oddness, Ed had charm. He fixed things, remembered birthdays, and once helped a widow mend her porch without charging her a cent. Loneliness became ritual. Evenings stretched endlessly, so he filled them with reading. What began with comic strips and Western pulp drifted toward true adventure magazines filled with stories of crime and anatomy. Later, searches of his home revealed stacks of publications focused on wartime medical experiments, cannibal tribes, and horror tales about grave robbers. They fed an obsession taking shape quietly, the same curiosity that had haunted him since childhood. He studied the human body, not scientifically, but with reverence mixed with distortion. To him, anatomy books were intimate. They bridged life and death, the same divide his mother had warned him never to cross. By day, Ed stayed busy fixing machinery or collecting scrap metal. By night, he read by kerosene lamp, clipping photographs from magazines and saving newspaper obituaries of recently buried women. In town, he was seen often at funerals, sometimes of people he barely knew. He stood off to the side of the service, expressionless, then disappeared before the burial ended. When asked why, he would say he liked to pay his respects. Most dismissed it as small-town kindness. Only later did investigators learn those obituaries became maps of a different kind. The difference between day and night for Ed blurred with each passing winter. Isolation twisted his thoughts inward, and dreams of his mother returned stronger every year. He spoke to her out loud, sometimes answering himself. Neighbors heard faint laughter at odd hours, the flicker of his lantern moving from room to room. Someone remarked that Ed looked right through you, like he was not entirely there. He was not. Much of his sense of self was still tied to Augusta. He wore her clothes when the farm was cold, claiming they reminded him of warmth. Whether symbolic or delusional, it deepened his bond with her memory. He rarely bought fresh meat after 1946. Instead, he hunted small animals and kept their parts preserved in jars, labeling them like specimens. He told a local grocer he had been learning about taxidermy, which explained the smell when he came into town. Formaldehyde mixed with must. Some laughed and said it fit his character. Others began locking their doors when Ed walked by. Still, no one thought he was dangerous. In psychological terms, Ed's world was collapsing into a single obsession: control over death. Losing Augusta had been unbearable. Keeping her presence alive became his way to cope. He surrounded himself with death in manageable amounts, animals first, then fantasies of resurrection. He read stories about ancient rituals and grave robbers who tried to bring spirits back. For Ed, the notion held something holy. Death was not punishment, it was passage. And perhaps passage could be reversed. He avoided women face to face but spoke about them often, usually through his mother's words. To friends at the tavern, he would say things like, Most women are trouble. Sometimes he contradicted himself, calling a young cashier pure like Ma used to be. People laughed uneasily. It sounded like rural awkwardness, not danger. But his view of womanhood had fractured into opposites, sacred and corrupt, both of which lived vividly in his imagination. The shrine to Augusta began to sink under dust, but Ed kept her room immaculate. Once a month, he entered quietly, sat in her chair, and read aloud from her Bible. Neighbors passing by at dusk could see the glow of a single lamp through the curtained window. He would sit there for hours, motionless, murmuring as if she might answer. Outside that room, his mind wandered further into fantasy. He started imagining ways to restore her physically, piecing together concepts he had read about in pulp magazines. Parts of the body became vessels, skin as clothing, memory living inside flesh. These were delusions, but to him they seemed scientific. He was not driven by mania or rage. It was longing shaped by isolation. Experts later described it as an extreme grief response, turned psychotic. For Ed, it was simply devotion taken beyond the living. Meanwhile, the town continued on. Children grew up, neighbors moved away, and the Gein farm rotted quietly past the tree line. The roof caved in places, tools rusted, and fields filled with weeds taller than a man. Inside, the floors bowed beneath clutter, yet Ed moved through it like routine. When radio news reported crimes or war casualties, he listened carefully, absorbing every mention of death. Headlines about missing people made him restless. He started keeping clippings, faces of women who reminded him of Augusta in youth. Local police later pieced together that during these years, Ed made test runs at cemeteries. He would visit graves of recently buried middle-aged women, sit by the markers, talk softly, and leave trinkets. It appeared innocent enough for a grieving man. In reality, it was rehearsal for what would soon follow. The boundaries between worship and violation were almost gone. Still, outwardly, Ed Gein remained the same quiet handyman. He attended church occasionally, lent tools, and fixed engines when asked. When a neighbor teased him about never dating, he just said, "Ma would not like it." People laughed, unaware that to Ed, Augusta's opinion still governed every choice. Her voice filled the silence of the farmhouse, guiding what came next. By the early 1950s, isolation had fermented into something irreversible. The man Plainfield thought it knew was an empty vessel, maintaining manners by habit. Inside, obsession ruled. He no longer saw the difference between honoring the dead and disturbing them. Soon, the graves of Plainfield would start to open, and the name Ed Gein would leave that lonely farm forever. By the early 1950s, Plainfield Cemetery lay quiet on the edge of town, its rows of modest stones brushing up against frozen cornfields. For most people, it was a place of rest. For Ed Gein, it became something else, a place of calling. Police would later learn that long before murder entered the story, Ed had been making nightly visits to those burial grounds. What he did there turned Plainfield's grief into terror. Investigators first suspected grave robbing after the farmhouse search in 1957. The sheer number of remains inside could not all belong to Bernice Worden. There were too many unique items: skulls, masks, and preserved pieces, clearly taken from multiple individuals. When questioned, Ed did not deny it. He told Sheriff Schley matter-of-factly that he had dug up a few women, maybe 9. He said he often chose recently buried ones who looked like Ma. His tone remained calm, like someone explaining an odd hobby. To him, he was not confessing to desecration. He was describing resurrection. The first clues came from a set of missing person cases stretching over several years. Families had noticed disturbed earth or missing keepsakes at grave sites, but no one had considered theft of bodies possible. Rural Wisconsin was not known for macabre crimes. When Gein pointed investigators to specific sites, they were skeptical, but when they began to dig, they found disturbed coffins, exactly where he said they would be. In one, the remains were gone completely except for scraps of clothing. In another, the casket lid had been pried open. The soil pattern matched tools found on Gein's property. It was undeniable. During interrogation, Ed described his nighttime trips with unsettling clarity. He said he read obituaries in the newspaper, seeking women who reminded him of Augusta, usually middle-aged and recently deceased. On nights when the moon felt right, he would load his pickup with a pry bar, shovels, and lanterns. He insisted he often fell into a trance during these drives, his memory foggy until he stood at the cemetery gate. Then, as he put it, something took over. He would dig quickly, spending hours in the cold dirt until reaching the coffin. Other times, he removed the body entirely and brought it back to the farm. Psychiatrists later determined that these actions fit the pattern of necromania combined with psychotic grief. But to Ed, they were acts of devotion. He claimed he never desecrated purely for pleasure, saying he was trying to bring her back. He told authorities he hoped constructing a suit of skin could somehow let him become Augusta, to feel her presence, to stop the loneliness. Doctors would call this delusional transvestitism with identity confusion. Ed simply said he wanted to be close to Ma. The scale shocked investigators. From his own admissions and physical evidence, at least 10 graves were disturbed between 1947 and 1952. Most were women who had died of natural causes and whose graves Gein revisited within days of burial. He remembered details with eerie precision, locations, markers, even the weather that night. Yet he often insisted he did not dig every time. Sometimes, he said, he just sat there and talked. Police could never fully confirm each claim, but the consistency of his descriptions left little doubt. Each trip followed the same ritual. He would drive under cover of darkness, park off a rural road, and walk across the field with his lantern shielded by a coffee can. After exhuming the body, he loaded it carefully, covering it with burlap sacks. Once home, he dissected what he collected in the shed near his kitchen. He treated each piece as material for an imagined reconstruction of his mother. Human skin became fabric, skulls became decoration, and internal parts were preserved in jars labeled by date or initials. He arranged some objects throughout the house like trophies, others like components of a larger project he could not name aloud. When agents catalogued his inventory in 1957, it resembled the inventory of a macabre museum. They found bowls carved from skulls, belts made of tanned human flesh, masks shaped from preserved faces, and chairs upholstered with skin. Ed explained their origins as though describing household crafts, most from the graveyard, some I made for Ma. To him, these were not crimes. They were extensions of grief, moulded into the physical world. In another context, he could have been considered an artist working with unthinkable materials. In reality, he was a delusional man, recreating his only relationship. Locals struggled to accept the facts when exhumations confirmed his stories. Families reopened graves only to find caskets empty. One relative fainted at the sight of disturbed bones. Others refused to ever visit the cemetery again. Plainfield's identity as a safe rural community fractured overnight. Churches addressed the fear in sermons. Hardware stores sold extra locks. Even sheriff's deputies carried guilt, realizing they had dismissed earlier reports of strange footprints near burial sites. For years, people had joked about Ed being a little off. Now, the laughter felt cruel. Psychologists reviewing the case later argued that Ed's grave robbing represented an attempt to master the loss of his mother. Without her, his social and moral framework collapsed. The grave visits gave him control over death, a reversal of helplessness. In his distorted logic, if he could possess parts of the dead, he could possess the comfort Augusta once gave. The behavior resembled religious ritual more than psychopathy, monumental sadness mixed with delusion. Yet it crossed every moral and human boundary imaginable. Asked why he stopped digging around 1953, Ed said the bodies got too stiff. Professionals interpreted that as the point where his dissociation began giving way to frustration. Graves no longer satisfied the illusion. He wanted the living essence his mother represented. For that, he would eventually need someone alive. His collecting turned from graves to flesh taken by force. The discovery of his grave robberies raised complex legal questions. Most states, including Wisconsin, had vague statutes on body desecration. Charges could be filed for property damage or theft, but nothing captured the enormity of what Ed had done. Prosecutors focused on murder once the connection to Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden emerged. Still, the grave evidence became critical to understanding his state of mind. Doctors examining him for trial relied heavily on these accounts to diagnose his mix of schizophrenia, necrophilic tendencies, and identity disorder. One psychiatrist wrote that Gein operated in the borderland between psychosis and mysticism. Reporters called Plainfield the town of the living dead. Sensational headlines turned local tragedy into national curiosity. Tourists arrived at the cemetery, taking photographs and stealing handfuls of dirt as souvenirs. Families of the disturbed graves requested privacy but rarely received it. Even clergy felt helpless. One minister publicly stated, "What he took from this ground cannot be given back." Within months, several families reburied relatives elsewhere, hoping distance could restore peace. Lawmen who listened to Ed's soft-spoken confessions described the experience as surreal. He showed no aggression, no remorse, only detached politeness. When asked whether he understood how horrific his acts were, he nodded gently and said, "I guess it was wrong, but it felt right at the time." That line, recorded in a sheriff's report, became emblematic of his mental split, rational awareness overshadowed by delusional justification. Ultimately, the grave robberies defined the boundary between Ed Gein, the eccentric farmer, and Ed Gein, the criminal legend. They were the bridge between grief and homicide, between fantasy and fulfillment. Once disturbing the dead no longer sustained his illusion, he looked toward the living. But eventually, stealing was not enough. Ed would need a living victim. Mary Hogan ran the Pine Grove Tavern on the snowy edge of Plainfield's main road. She was 44 and loud in the way quiet towns notice. Locals liked her quick humor and her impatience with gossip. She cursed like a truck driver and called everyone kid. People either adored or avoided her, but everyone knew who she was. To Ed Gein, she was both foreign and familiar, a woman whose face and shape somehow reminded him of Augusta, but whose words were everything Augusta despised. By 1954, Ed's dark habits had slowed but not stopped. The grave visits became rare, and the fantasy of bringing anyone back was fading. He still kept his clipping books, studied anatomy magazines, and spent long evenings reading by lantern. When he first met Mary at the tavern, he went mostly for company. He would sit at the corner stool nursing a single beer, responding politely when she teased him about being too quiet for a drinker. Neighbours remembered seeing him there often, awkward but friendly. She would laugh, call him Eddie from the sticks, and hand him a sandwich on the house. For Ed, those moments felt almost domestic, like some strange echo of affection. To the regulars, Mary was tough and independent. She had moved to Plainfield only a few years earlier from Chicago, leaving behind a failed marriage and rumours of less respectable work. She was brash in a way that rubbed some men wrong. Augusta would have called her sinful. To Ed, that contradiction fascinated him. He would drive past the tavern at night just to see its lights glowing through the trees, imagining Augusta preaching disapproval and hearing himself agree, even as he loitered outside, wanting to step inside. That tug between fascination and condemnation built over the following months, until fantasy carried him further than restraint. On the night of December 8th, 1954, snow had started falling again across Waushara County. The Pine Grove Tavern stayed open late, as usual. Around closing, Mary told a friend she wanted to shut early and go home. No one saw her after that. The next morning, the tavern door stood ajar. Blood pooled near the bar and trailed toward the back door. Her cash register was missing, along with several bills from the till. Plainfield's sheriff, Art Schley, investigated but found few clues. They guessed robbery, maybe a traveller passing through. The community mourned her disappearance, but soon returned to routine. People half joked when her name came up that Old Eddie took her home. The joke was not cruel at first, just a small-town way of teasing the eccentric man who listened too much to his mother's ghost. At the time, there was no evidence linking Ed to any violence. He remained the quiet handyman who lent tools and patched roofs. The gossip faded. It was not until 3 years later, after his arrest for Bernice Worden's murder, that officers discovered just how literal that joke had been. When deputies combed through the farmhouse in November 1957, they found items too numerous to process in one night. Among them were preserved remains, later identified through forensic examination as belonging to Mary Hogan. She had not vanished. She had been kept. The discovery rewrote Plainfield's recent history in a single horrifying moment. Investigators pieced together how Ed had lured her from the tavern under the pretense of help or conversation, then shot her once with a .22 caliber pistol. He loaded her into his truck and brought her back to the farm before dawn. The crime seemed methodical rather than impulsive. He told police after his arrest that he did not remember it clearly, describing the event as though he were observing someone else acting. His voice stayed calm. "It felt like Ma was near that night," he reportedly said, emphasizing that he believed Augusta wanted him to act against women she considered unclean. Those words unnerved the detectives more than the evidence itself. The murder of Mary Hogan was not about rage. It was about obedience to a phantom. Cross-referencing Ed's confession with physical evidence revealed a timeline that fit the missing person report exactly. Ballistics from his rifle matched the shell casing found at the tavern. Hair and tissue fragments on his tools matched remains discovered in his house. What shocked investigators most was the difference in Ed's demeanor. He did not act like a man caught in murder. He behaved like someone explaining misplaced belongings. When Sheriff Schley asked him if he realized Mary was dead, Ed nodded and said, "I guess so. She had been gone a while." That mild tone haunted the sheriff for the rest of his life. For the people of Plainfield, the revelation turned laughter to revulsion. Those who had repeated the "Ed took her home" joke refused to speak of it again. Regular customers of Mary's Tavern gathered outside its boarded windows, silent and pale. Some still hoped there was a mistake, but newspapers confirmed the match through dental records. In a single day, humour transformed into guilt. Everyone had known Ed, but no one had known what he was. Psychiatrists later examined why Mary became his first living target. They concluded she embodied what Ed's mother condemned most: outspoken independence and confidence. She represented defiance personified. Killing her, to Ed, was both retribution and fulfillment. The act blurred the boundary between devotion to Augusta and hatred of women who defied her image. One report described it as a psychological collision of repression and yearning. In practical terms, it was murder committed with the serenity of religious duty. Following Ed's confession, officers exhumed more evidence from the property. They found Mary's jewellery, traces of ash, and articles unmistakably linked to her. Each discovery deepened the horror, proof that her disappearance had not been quick or impersonal. Ed had kept reminders as part of the world he was building within those walls. A world where the line between his mother and all other women ceased to exist. Plainfield's response bordered on disbelief. Churches filled that week as people sought words to scrub the images forming in their minds. Parents warned children never to roam the countryside alone. Even acquaintances who had defended Ed as harmless wanted distance from the memory. Reporters brought national media to the frozen highway, turning the small Wisconsin farm into a symbol of evil's ordinariness. Across the country, headlines spoke of the ghoul of Plainfield. Yet those closest to the case insisted he did not fit the monster stereotype. He was quiet, polite, and meek. Proof, they said, that horror does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. In legal terms, the Mary Hogan case was harder to prosecute. By 1957, Ed faced certain conviction for the murder of Bernice Worden, which offered stronger evidence. Still, Hogan's death served as prelude and pattern. It showed the escalation from fantasy to physical act, the point where loneliness demanded a living sacrifice. When questioned again about her, Ed looked down and murmured, "She reminded me of Ma, but not the good parts." Those few words encapsulated the distorted morality driving him. Years later, psychiatrists would analyze audio transcripts of his interviews, noting that his tone softened whenever he mentioned Mary. He referred to her as "poor Mary" once, as though he pitied the very victim he created. That complexity, tenderness mixed with horror, became central to understanding him. For Ed Gein, murder was not about power, it was about contact. Each act was an attempt to close the distance between himself and the mother he had lost. The Pine Grove Tavern never reopened. Its wooden sign faded until the letters were barely visible. Locals tore it down quietly, hoping to end the gossip. But the space where it once stood remained a scar on the town's sense of safety. The woman who had once brought laughter and chaos to cold winter nights had vanished into legend, a victim of one man's delusion and a community's casual trust. Even that horror did not prepare them for what happened in 1957. On the morning of November 16th, 1957, Plainfield awoke under a thin veil of frost. It was the first day of deer season, and many residents were in the woods before dawn. Bernice Worden opened her hardware store at sunrise, as she had for years. She was a familiar figure, 58 years old, practical, with a calm voice that steadied customers who came to buy hunting supplies or hardware parts. Her son, Frank, worked as deputy sheriff and often checked on her throughout the day. That Saturday, he left for hunting, assuming his mother's routine was as predictable as ever. By nightfall, she was gone. At about 5 p.m., Frank returned to find the store dark, the door unlocked, and blood on the floor leading toward the back room. The cash register was missing, and so was his mother. Instinct told him this was not a robbery gone wrong. When he checked the sales log, the last entry stopped him cold. A receipt made out to Ed Gein. 2 gallons of antifreeze. Sheriff Art Schley and Deputy Dan Chase immediately started toward Gein's farm, a few miles outside of town. Everyone in Plainfield knew Ed, the mild handyman who lived alone on his mother's property. He had been around the hardware store the day before, talking casually with Bernice about prices and weather. To Frank, his mother's disappearance and that receipt felt like a thread that could unravel everything. He told Schley, "If Ma sold antifreeze to Ed, check there first." It was not an accusation, just desperation framed as a clue. When officers reached the Gein property, night had already settled across the frozen fields. The place looked abandoned. There was no smoke from the chimney and no sign of light. They knocked, but no one answered. Ed was reportedly in town at a neighbor's house. Schley decided to wait for daylight, but curiosity led them to the unlocked barn. What they discovered made them forget the cold entirely. Hanging from a rafter was the body of a woman, decapitated and prepared like game from a hunt. It was Bernice Worden. The discovery stunned the officers. Each detail defied comprehension. The precision of the cut, the methodical preparation, the familiarity of someone who had done such tasks before. The barn was quiet, except for the chains twisting slightly in the draft. It was not the chaos of a murderer's frenzy. It was the order of ritual. They stepped outside and called for reinforcements, careful to close the door as if shielding her from further indignity. That night, a team surrounded Ed's house and arrested him without struggle. He was found at a neighbor's kitchen table, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper headline about Bernice's disappearance, as if he were not connected to it. When told they were taking him in, he simply said, "Worden's at my place, ain't she?" The officers exchanged glances, uncertain whether he was confessing or delusional. Later, that statement would become one of the most chilling in Wisconsin law enforcement history, not for what it revealed, but for how calmly he spoke it. Inside the farmhouse, investigators entered the world Ed Gein had created. Each room was a grotesque parody of a home, cluttered with relics of death. They found Bernice's head, stored in a sack, tools stained beyond recognition, and countless objects crafted from human remains. Police photographers documented everything, their flashes punctuating the silence like lightning strikes. Forensic experts later counted at least 15 distinct human sources across the materials inside. The horror no longer fit into words. When confronted with these findings, Ed did not protest. In his soft voice, he described how he had gone to the store that morning to buy antifreeze. He said Bernice had let him handle the gun she kept near the counter. It went off, accidentally, he claimed, shooting her. Instead of panic, he felt an odd calm. He loaded her body into his truck and drove home. He mentioned hanging her like deer because that is how he had been taught to handle death. The officers listened, appalled at how procedural his explanation sounded. To him, death lacked moral weight. It was a task. His detailed confessions painted the timeline. He shot Bernice between 9:30 and 10 a.m., cleaned the blood at the scene, and locked the store before driving back. He worked methodically all afternoon in the barn, preparing her body as though reenacting something rehearsed. When questioned about motive, he murmured, "I thought maybe Ma would like her." That sentence became the psychological core of the entire case. Murkier than insanity, deeper than rage. As medical experts examined the remains, they confirmed overlaps with numerous missing persons reports spanning a decade. Bones, organs, and preserved fragments bound the Worden case directly to Ed's grave robberies. It explained the origin of the artifacts found in his house and how long he had been living surrounded by the dead. Neighbors recalled occasional aromas drifting from his chimney that made them turn away, assuming he was burning animal hides. They had not been wrong, just unaware of what kind. The investigation consumed Plainfield. Reporters arrived first by car, then by helicopter, trampling snow and privacy alike. The morning after his arrest, the town's population doubled with strangers holding cameras. Sheriff Schley tried to maintain control, keeping details sealed, but word spread faster than containment. Rumor inflated each truth. 10 victims became 20, furniture became whole skins. Even so, reality remained worse than fiction. Frank Worden sat through each briefing, stoic yet crumbling inside. He had followed every lead, only to discover his mother's remains catalogued as evidence. When asked later about Ed, he said quietly, "He looked right through people. Maybe that's why no one saw him coming." That remark captured the town's collective guilt. They had trusted the harmless handyman who fixed their barns, never realizing the interior life he was building miles away. Psychiatrists later observed that the murder of Bernice Worden marked the transformation of Gein's fantasies into deliberate homicide. Whereas Mary Hogan's death hinted at confusion, Bernice's killing was preparation, ritual, and completion. Experts speculated that he chose her because she embodied maternal qualities, stern, respectable, and moral. In his delusion, she blurred with Augusta. Killing her might have symbolized trying to merge two realities, the mother he worshipped and the women she condemned. Interrogation records show moments of startling lucidity amid his confusion. When asked whether he recognized Bernice's humanity, he said, "She seemed nice. Ma would not have liked her, but she seemed nice." That split loyalty between affection and obedience explained everything that followed. His crimes were not simply acts of violence, they were attempts to reconcile devotion with memory, morality with madness. At Ed's property, Investigators worked for days, collecting remains and sealing containers. Ordinary townsfolk volunteered, believing it would restore decency, but most left long before nightfall, unable to stomach the scene. The list of seized items filled dozens of pages. Each piece, lanterns made of skin, masks, bowls from skulls, told the same story of a man chasing memory through horror. By Sunday, Plainfield's church bells rang not for service, but for reassurance. Parents whispered during sermons, asking how to tell their children the truth. Legal proceedings began within weeks, transferring Ed to a secure facility for psychiatric evaluation. Newspapers printed his mild photograph beside lurid headlines: House of Horror Farmer, Wisconsin Cannibal, Mad Butcher of Plainfield. The town hated every headline, but could not deny their accuracy. For psychologists, the Bernice Worden case provided rare insight into psychotic identity disorders. His calm obedience and lack of motive beyond delusion challenged legal definitions of sanity itself. For Plainfield, it left scars that time could not hide. The farm stood fenced, tools still rusting on the porch, windows broken, snow drifting through. Children dared each other to get close, but even decades later, few did. In the end, what investigators saw that night went beyond crime. It was the physical manifestation of loneliness, years of silent worship, twisting into ritualized death. The farmhouse was not just a scene, it was Ed Gein's mind turned inside out. The murder of Bernice Worden ended the illusion that he was harmless, but it also revealed how isolation can grow monstrous when left unseen. What investigators saw would haunt them forever, and the truth behind it was even darker. At the State Crime Laboratory, doctors struggled to categorize what they were seeing. The remains, the craftsmanship, the calmness of Ed's confessions, none of it matched traditional definitions of criminal behavior. To the Wisconsin authorities, Gein was not a typical murderer driven by impulse or greed. He was an enigma between illness and intention. Understanding him required dismantling not only his crimes but also the careful logic that governed them. Soon after his arrest, Ed was declared unfit for trial and transferred to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun. There, psychiatrists met a man described as courteous, soft-spoken, and strangely cooperative. He addressed doctors as "Sir," thanked nurses for meals, and spent hours answering questions in the same tone he might use to discuss weather. His politeness made the interviews haunting. Beneath that mild exterior, they found a psyche split by delusion and repression. The first evaluations documented a flat affect, a lack of familiar emotional responses. When asked about Bernice Worden or Mary Hogan, Ed did not express anger or guilt. He spoke instead about getting ideas and things being cloudy. Dr. George Arndt, a psychiatrist who interviewed him extensively, wrote that Gein does not distinguish between fantasy and waking reality. He moves within, both without transition. Another examiner described him as living in two worlds, one of Plainfield's fields and barns, another of imagined resurrections. Doctors quickly recognized symptoms of chronic schizophrenia, marked by auditory hallucinations and dissociative episodes. They also noted evidence of obsessive-compulsive tendencies and identity confusion, conditions rarely studied at the time. Gein confessed to keeping bodies because he felt alone to the bone, explaining that when he used parts from corpses, he imagined making a friend from what was left. The line chilled the staff. It revealed loneliness weaponized by delusion, an attempt to create companionship out of death. The psychiatric team charted his development backwards. As a child, his mother's domination taught him that women were both sacred and corrupt. When she died, those opposing images collided. He could not accept Augusta's death, because doing so meant losing his only moral anchor. Instead, he created rituals to make her return plausible. His mind converted faith into tangible acts. Grave digging was not rebellion, it was obedience to her perceived will. Each exhumed corpse was a distorted prayer. During interviews, Ed frequently referred to his body crafting as projects. He said he wanted to make a woman's suit so he could be inside her, like walking in Mars' skin. Doctors debated how literally to take that confession. Some viewed it as a metaphor for wanting to embody his mother's strength. Others saw a genuine psychotic plan to erase the boundary between self and idol. Every psychiatrist agreed it signified identity confusion, so severe he no longer recognized himself as separate from her. When ordered to take standardized intelligence and personality tests, Ed scored within normal range. He was not intellectually impaired. What stunned clinicians was how reason coexisted with madness. He could recall farming techniques, market prices, and weather patterns precisely, then segue without pause into describing his conversations with Augusta's voice. One examiner compared his cognitive pattern to a cracked mirror, each shard reflecting a piece of rational thought, but none aligning into coherence. Staff observations painted a portrait of contradiction. He read comic books and farm journals during recreation hours, and never caused disturbances. Yet at night, nurses reported hearing him whisper prayers mixed with fragments of his mother's name. He was fascinated by hospital maintenance work, asking repeatedly about tools, cleaners, and plumbing. Once, when told he could not help with minor repairs, he said gently, "I've been good with fixing things." The normalcy of his manner unsettled employees more than aggression would have. State psychiatrists produced dozens of reports detailing overlapping diagnoses, including schizophrenia with obsessive-compulsive features, a form of gender dysphoria linked to maternal identification, and delusional mourning behaviors. Each tried to define what combination of isolation and control had hollowed him. They noted that Ed never expressed pleasure from his actions, distinguishing him from typical offenders. His motive was possession, not desire. He wanted proximity to an idealized figure he could no longer reach. Interview transcripts revealed how his mental landscape functioned. He spoke in short sentences with concrete imagery. When asked how he chose his victims, he said, "They seemed kind, like Ma before she got sick." When doctors asked if he understood death, he replied, "People look asleep. If you take care, they stay nice for a while." The phrasing indicated genuine belief that death was reversible through care, not cruelty. It fit a model of psychotic mourning called magical reattachment, where grief seeks to physically preserve the lost loved one. In exploring the deeper structure of his delusion, psychologists compared his behavior to religious ritual. The farmhouse items were not trophies. They were relics arranged with reverence. He surrounded himself with fragments to reconstruct a world untouched by loss. The locked parlor, dedicated to Augusta, symbolized holiness. The cluttered rooms outside represented exile. When asked why he sealed her door, he explained, "It kept her clean," he meant spiritually. While confined, Ed showed limited awareness that his acts violated morality. He conceded they were against the law, but argued it was not really killing if they were already dead. This rationalization provided insight into his moral reasoning. Legality existed, but ethics were filtered through Augusta's doctrine. Within his delusional belief system, death did not end personhood, it paused it. His acts became caretaking rather than homicide. As therapists probed further, Ed revealed that he heard his mother's voice years after her death. She sometimes scolded him for impure thoughts or encouraged him to correct wrongdoing. He could not recall if the voices came before his first grave robbery, but he insisted they guided him toward the cemetery. Auditory hallucinations like these supported the schizophrenia diagnosis. They also explained why his crimes appeared methodical rather than impulsive. He believed he was following instruction. Doctors faced the question every court would later ask: was Ed Gein criminally insane or morally evil? The consensus leaned toward insanity. He understood fragments of legality but lacked grasp of reality's boundaries. When examiners introduced hypothetical scenarios about right and wrong, he responded in biblical analogies, citing punishment and resurrection rather than human law. Dr. Arndt summarized it succinctly. He replaced the 10 Commandments with one, "Honor thy mother." Reports from hospital staff depicted a patient paradoxically easier to manage than most. He ate modestly, followed rules, and thanked orderlies. They wrote that he rarely displayed anger and often smiled when spoken to. For them, it was disconcerting. A man capable of unimaginable acts behaving like a model patient. Some attendants even admitted to forgetting his crimes during daily routines. Only when reading newspapers filled with his name did reality return. Over time, treatment focused on medication and structured routines. Thorazine reduced his hallucinations, but the absence of voices sometimes left him listless. Nurses noted that he often stared at walls for hours. When asked what he was thinking, he said, "I do not hear Ma anymore. It is quiet." To psychiatrists, that statement represented progress. To Ed, it was loss. Despite therapy, he never developed remorse in the conventional sense. He accepted confinement as consequence, but not as moral judgment. Across interviews, he displayed minimal comprehension of public outrage. When told his farm had become a tourist destination, he seemed curious, but indifferent. He asked if the barn was still standing. That detachment revealed both awareness and distance, recognition of external events without emotional engagement. Experts described it as depersonalization, the psychological armor of a man who processed trauma by disconnecting from reality. Forensic psychologists extracted lessons from his case that later influenced diagnostic categories. He embodied how isolation, grief, and severe maternal dominance could merge into psychosis without overt violence until triggered. His lack of criminal record before 40 indicated long-term latent disorder. Many investigators concluded that if Augusta had lived longer, Ed might never have killed. Her presence cruel but stabilizing. Her death removed the only structure his mind recognized. Legal discussions surrounding Gein's responsibility continued for years. When the question of sanity reached court in the late 1960s, experts cited these earlier hospital observations. They testified that he suffered from a chronic mental disease, rendering him incapable of appreciating the wrongfulness of his conduct. Prosecutors argued that his planning showed awareness, but even they admitted his motive stemmed from delusion rather than greed or malice. The judge accepted the psychiatric determination of insanity, committing him indefinitely. For the broader public, those conclusions blurred distinctions between madness and evil. Film directors and writers soon drew inspiration from his contradictions. Gentle voice, domestic horror, devotion twisted into desecration. But within hospital walls, he remained quiet, folding laundry during group therapy, humming hymns from childhood. Staff nicknamed him Old Eddie, long after media attention moved on. In private notes, one psychiatrist wrote, "He is both victim and author of his isolation." That line summarized what many came to believe. Ed Gein's violence grew not from hatred, but from a void of human connection. Years in confinement revealed no hidden rage or duplicity, only emptiness where empathy should reside. When questioned late in life about whether he missed Plainfield, he smiled faintly and said, "It was peaceful there." Even confined, Ed's story did not end. It spread beyond Plainfield into textbooks, film scripts, and cultural nightmares. Inside the institution, he aged quietly. Outside, his mind's blueprints reshaped how society imagined the face of madness. Each retelling examined anew how deprivation, dogma, and delusion can twist an ordinary human longing for love into unspeakable ritual. For doctors, Ed Gein was a study in fractured humanity. For everyone else, he was proof that the most terrifying monsters may never realize they are monsters at all. When Ed Gein was declared competent to stand trial in late 1968, more than a decade had passed since his arrest. The small courthouse in Waushara County had seen its share of local disputes, but nothing comparable to the quiet man now seated at the defense table. Age and confinement had left Ed frail. His hair had thinned, his posture stooped, and his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses. This was no longer the farmer who had once haunted Plainfield. He was, by all outward appearances, an elderly patient waiting for instructions. Yet behind that vacant calm sat one of the most infamous defendants in American history. The proceeding lasted less than a week, though preparation had dragged on for years. The delay came from psychiatric evaluations, legal appeals, and endless debate over how to classify his mental state. Prosecutors wanted to ensure that justice for Bernice Worden was recorded formally, even if the outcome was predetermined. The charge was simple: one count of first-degree murder. The complexity lay in whether the man charged understood his crime. The trial opened on November 7th, 1968. Judge Robert H. Golmar presided without a jury. Both sides had agreed that publicity would make an impartial jury impossible. The courtroom filled with reporters, psychologists, and a handful of Plainfield residents who still carried conflicting emotions: curiosity, anger, and fatigue. Sheriff Schley, retired by then, refused to attend. He said he had seen enough of Gein to last him a lifetime. Ed's attorney, William Belter, presented the insanity defense that doctors had supported for years. He explained that Gein's acts stemmed from psychotic delusions born of isolation and maternal domination. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Fitzgerald, did not disagree about insanity, but sought to preserve the record of guilt. They wanted history to state clearly that Ed Gein had murdered Bernice Worden, regardless of his mind's condition. Witness testimony recounted the investigation succinctly: the receipt for antifreeze, the arrest, the discoveries in the farmhouse. Photographs of evidence were entered under seal, but described aloud in careful terms. No one wanted sensationalism. The courtroom remained eerily quiet, except for the rustle of papers and the soft hum of a tape recorder documenting each word. When asked to stand and state his plea, Ed spoke firmly: "Not guilty by reason of insanity." It was the only clear sentence he uttered during the entire proceeding. Experts from Central State Hospital took the stand to summarize years of observation. They described Ed as cooperative, non-violent, and permanently detached from reality. "Doctor," Aunt told the court that Gein lived in a chronic state of schizophrenic psychosis at the time of the crime. He believed his mother directed him through auditory hallucinations and that his actions did not arise from rational thought. The prosecution did not challenge these findings. Instead, they focused on documenting intent through routine, how he had planned purchases, moved the body, and concealed evidence. Their goal was not conviction for its own sake, but acknowledgement that a life had been taken deliberately, not erased by legal abstraction. Throughout the testimony, Ed listened without visible reaction. He occasionally smiled faintly when doctors mentioned his cooperation, as if proud of being a good patient. At one point, when photographs of Bernice Worden were mentioned, he lowered his gaze, but not from shame. It looked more like confusion, as though recalling a vague dream. Observers scribbled notes describing his demeanor as benign to the point of unreality. Closing arguments barely filled an hour. The district attorney summarized the state's position that Ed Gein committed the acts in question, but was clearly insane at the time. Belter concurred, adding that punishment would serve no purpose other than cruelty. Judge Golmar recessed briefly before delivering his decision. When he returned, he read from his notes in an even tone. The court found Edward Theodore Gein guilty of the offence charged as to the act, but legally insane at the time of its commission. He was recommitted to Central State Hospital for the rest of his natural life. The proceedings ended at 2:35 p.m., 11 years after the crimes that had shattered Plainfield. The outcome surprised no one, yet the atmosphere in the room felt heavy. Reporters rushed to telephones. Locals left silently. For Frank Worden and the remaining families affected by Ed's actions, the judgment offered neither closure nor true justice. Insanity felt like leniency to some, though doctors insisted it was simply accurate. Wisconsin law provided no death penalty, and few believed Ed truly understood where he was. As the bailiff led him out, someone asked if he had anything to say. He hesitated, then muttered, "I am sorry about what happened to Mrs. Worden." Whether those words reflected comprehension or repetition of what doctors told him to express, no one could tell. Life inside the institution settled into monotony. Gein transferred between Central State and Mendota Mental Health Institute, depending on overcrowding and shifts in treatment policy. Staff described him as model behavior, helpful, polite, rarely disruptive. He read magazines, worked in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, and attended occupational therapy sessions where patients practiced woodworking or painting. Some employees admitted they forgot his history until new staff whispered, "That is the man from Plainfield." Over the years, visitors' curiosity waned. Journalists occasionally requested interviews, all denied. The state wanted to minimize sensational coverage. A few psychiatrists continued to study his case, focusing on language patterns and emotional flatness. Many noted that Ed seemed content within institutional walls. The routines replaced the structure his mother once provided: regular meals, instructions, authority. The hospital became a surrogate parent, consistent and predictable. He thrived quietly in captivity, showing how environment could pacify even the most disturbed mind when boundaries were clear. During the 1970s and early 1980s, Ed experienced minor health problems, arthritis, impaired vision, and later cancer. When doctors discussed mortality, he showed no fear. He said death meant going where Ma went. Nurses heard him humming hymns on evenings before medical procedures, always calm, never resistant. He rarely spoke of his crimes, referring instead to the old case. To new attendants, unaware of his past, he came across as an unremarkable elderly man with gentle manners. Outside, public fascination resurged as his story inspired films and books. Requests for his correspondence flooded the hospital, but administrators withheld them. Within Plainfield, time dulled outrage but not memory. The farm had long been demolished, burned down by unknown arsonists in 1958, the night before it was scheduled for auction. People said the flames ended its curse, though the empty land remained a place of unease. Over the years, Ed's grave marker in the town cemetery was stolen repeatedly until officials stored what was left in secret. The town preferred absence to reminder. Inside Mendota, Ed's final years passed quietly. He attended chapel services, helped clean tables, and celebrated small holidays with other patients. Staff described him as almost gentle, incapable of imagining the violence behind his history. He never again spoke of hearing voices. When asked in an evaluation whether he still thought of his mother, he answered, "Every day, but it does not hurt anymore." Those were among his last recorded words. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure at the age of 77. The hospital notified few people, no family remained. His burial occurred quietly in Plainfield Cemetery beside Augusta, the woman who had defined his entire existence. Only a handful of officials attended. The rest of the town pretended not to notice, though nearly everyone knew. As dusk settled that evening, the cemetery stood empty except for the fresh mound and a single wooden cross marking the spot until a proper stone could be placed. By then, his legend had already escaped Wisconsin. Stories, films, and analyses surpassed the facts, turning the quiet handyman into an archetype of isolated madness. For the people who had lived through it, the myth was almost easier to bear than the truth. A frail man whose loneliness grew until it swallowed everyone near him. In the sterile hallways of Mendota, he ended his life the way it had begun, alone, polite, and haunted by a mother's voice only he could hear. When news of the Plainfield murders spread, the world did not just recoil, it became obsessed. The details coming out of Wisconsin in the late 1950s sounded like fiction, something beyond the scope of ordinary crime. Newspapers on both coasts called Ed Gein America's real-life ghoul, and reporters filled pages describing his farmhouse without truly understanding what they were seeing. Once the shock eased, fascination took hold. Within months, Gein's story passed from crime columns into the bloodstream of popular culture, eventually giving birth to some of Hollywood's most enduring monsters. Writers were the first to transform curiosity into creation. In 1959, novelist Robert Bloch, who lived only 50 miles from Plainfield, began drafting a story loosely inspired by what he had read in local papers. He never visited the crime scene or met Gein. All he needed were the facts: a lonely man, a dead mother, and a decaying house that hid the unthinkable. From those fragments came Psycho. When Alfred Hitchcock adapted it into film a year later, Norman Bates was born, a mild-mannered motel clerk, obsessed with his mother, calm on the surface but fractured within. Viewers shuddered at the ending revelation, not realizing how closely it echoed the quiet man who had once bought antifreeze from Bernice Worden. The influence extended far beyond one film. In the 1970s, decades after the farm had burned, a new generation of filmmakers used real-world horror to reflect America's growing unease. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was perhaps the most direct interpretation. Its chaotic violence and grotesque imagery were fictional, but Leatherface's mask of human skin came straight from the police reports of Plainfield. Hooper later explained that he wanted to capture the atmosphere of fear and decay felt in small towns, places where evil hides in routine rather than the supernatural. The film's low budget only amplified its realism, leaving audiences shaken not by fantasy but by recognition. Thomas Harris, writing a decade later, mined similar territory for his novel The Silence of the Lambs. The character of Buffalo Bill shared features lifted almost verbatim from Gein, crafting garments from human skin and equating transformation with physical disguise. When the movie adaptation succeeded in the early 1990s, younger audiences learned Gein's story secondhand without realizing it. He had become a mythic DNA encoded into cinematic terror, silently shaping how the world visualized insanity. Back in Wisconsin, that transformation cut both ways. Residents of Plainfield resented the attention. Their town, once barely a dot on the map, became shorthand for depravity. Tourists arrived, hoping to glimpse remnants of the House of Horrors, only to find an empty field. Souvenir hunters combed the cemetery despite pleas from families to stay away. Shopkeepers refused to talk, and local newspapers stopped printing stories entirely for a time. Yet curiosity persisted. Each new movie revived the same question: how could ordinary rural life create such darkness? For Plainfield, the answer felt endlessly misrepresented. Ethical debates grew with each retelling. Critics argued that filmmakers profited from real pain, reducing victims to props. Others countered that art reflects the culture's need to confront fear safely. In classrooms, criminologists used Gein's case to discuss the boundaries between pathology and evil. Students dissected his interviews, searching for meaning behind the calm tone. A man once dismissed as insane had become a subject of intellectual fascination, dissected by psychology and popular culture alike. That divide between real suffering and symbolic fear has shadowed his legacy ever since. The fascination was not limited to film. Musicians referenced his name in lyrics. Authors wrote novels tracing the psychology of isolation, and tabloid magazines recycled his image whenever public interest in horror spiked. Each retelling trimmed complexity for shock or moral lesson. The human being, sick, deluded, and pitiful, became overshadowed by the caricature of the mad butcher. Yet the core of the story remained alluring because it eroded comforting assumptions. If Ed Gein could exist quietly for decades in a peaceful town, then normalcy itself offered no safety. That implication haunted audiences more than gore ever could. In 1958, just months after his trial, the Gein farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. Firefighters arrived too late to save it, and locals quietly agreed not to rebuild. Some believed it was arson by townspeople wanting closure. Others said it was accidental. Whatever the cause, the flames erased the tangible reminder of horror, leaving behind cold ashes and a single concrete foundation. When word spread, one Plainfield resident reportedly sighed, "Good riddance." For the first time since the discovery, the town slept without the silhouette of that barn against the sky. The artifacts removed earlier ensured the story's survival. Photographs entered crime exhibits, copied by journalists, studied by criminologists. Museums sought to borrow pieces, an idea the state rejected immediately. Officials understood that any display would turn tragedy into attraction. Despite safeguards, rumors spread internationally about exhibits featuring Gein's possessions, none of which truly existed. The myth had overtaken the evidence. In later decades, when true crime entertainment flourished, Ed's case became the template for countless documentaries and books. Each sought new psychological interpretation, Freudian, sociological, or theological, but all circled the same paradox. A gentle voice paired with unimaginable acts. Audiences watched not to understand him, but to reassure themselves that they were nothing like him. Ironically, that reassurance fueled the genre's popularity. The more viewers compared their own sanity against Gein's madness, the more they returned for another comparison. Plainfield's relationship with its past remained uneasy. Some residents tried to reclaim normalcy by promoting hunting and fishing tourism. Others left town entirely. Even decades later, when film crews requested permission to shoot near the cemetery, the answer was always no. Silence became the community's defense. Still, every Halloween, letters arrived at the sheriff's office asking for directions to the old Gein place. No one received an answer. The legacy extended most powerfully into the collective imagination of horror itself. Before Gein, cinematic villains were often charming masterminds or supernatural fiends. After him, filmmakers turned inward, exploring terror born from loneliness and repression. Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, each reflected pieces of Ed that society recognized yet did not want to claim. Devotion without empathy, morality, warped by guilt, and the chilling ordinariness of evil. Scholars later called it the Plainfield archetype, the monster who looks harmless until the walls come down. Decades after his death, fascination shifted toward the philosophical. Writers debated whether recounting his story endlessly granted him a form of immortality he never sought. Others argued that confronting such darkness prevents its repetition. Neither answer satisfied Plainfield, where families of victims still lived quietly with the burden of notoriety. When vandals eventually stole Ed's gravestone in 2000, the town replaced it with grass and anonymity. The plot remains unmarked today, an intentional forgetting, yet forgetting has never been complete. The films, books, and commentary ensure that Ed Gein's presence lingers, not as celebration, but as warning. His crimes forced Americans to rethink what isolation, fanatic belief, and loneliness can produce when left unseen. Each artistic adaptation, however fictionalized, carries that echo. The characters he inspired stalk screens worldwide, but none erase the reality beneath them. A small farmhouse, a lonely man, and a community forever altered by what hid behind its closed doors. When investigators, doctors, and townspeople tried to make sense of what had happened on that bleak stretch of Wisconsin farmland, they all ran into the same problem. How do you explain a man like Ed Gein without turning him into either a symbol or a joke? Over the years, he became both a punchline for macabre humor and a blueprint for fictional killers, yet the deeper lesson lay buried beneath that noise. His story was not simply about gore or madness, it was about what happens when isolation becomes a substitute for humanity. From the beginning, Gein's life unfolded in a kind of slow suffocation. Every person who might have offered perspective or affection disappeared until only two forces remained: his mother's voice and his own imagination. In psychiatric terms, he was a study in environmental deprivation. Deprived of emotional contact, community, and correction, he built an inner world that replaced them all. When reality contradicted that world, he changed reality to match. The crimes that shocked Plainfield were extreme examples of the same instinct that drives anyone who feels unseen to create an environment where they cannot be ignored, even if that environment exists only inside the mind. The house itself represented that failure of connection. Investigators remembered silence so deep that even wind seemed cautious. The boarded-up rooms were not only relics of obsession, but monuments to fear of decay. Ed wanted everything sacred to remain exactly as it was. Psychologists later said that this impulse to freeze a loved one's space in time is common among mourners. Most eventually release it. Ed never did. He amplified his grief until it replaced human contact entirely. His isolation grew literal, miles from town, fields enclosing the property, winters cutting him off for weeks. What began as protection slowly transformed into delusion. For Plainfield, the trauma lingered for generations. People born decades after 1957 still grew up hearing warnings about wandering too far after dark. The town rarely discussed the killings openly, but the absence of conversation became its own memorial. The burned foundation of the farm stayed empty, overgrown with grass and thistle. Some locals swore they could still feel unease driving past it. Historians noted that Plainfield's population never truly recovered. Businesses closed. People moved away. The stigma settled like dust. The line between community identity and individual evil blurred until outsiders saw them as one. To residents, that was the hardest wound to live with. The idea that one man's madness defined everyone else's home. In universities and psychological journals, Gein's case became required reading. Analysts focused on 4 recurring themes: isolation, maternal fixation, religious guilt, and societal denial. The combination formed a perfect storm. Each factor alone might have produced eccentricity. Together they produced psychosis. The term Gein complex briefly appeared in early forensic psychology courses to describe extreme dependency fused with delusional devotion. It was later replaced by more clinical language, but the insight remained. Unchecked loneliness can mimic faith, and repetition can harden grief into ritual. Several criminologists pointed out something easily overlooked amid the horror. Before his crimes were exposed, Ed was not terrifying. He was invisible. He was the kind man who fixed engines for neighbors, who greeted cashiers softly, who waved from his truck. People saw oddity, not peril. In that blind spot lay a harsher truth about small-town life. Familiarity can hide dysfunction, because confronting it feels impolite. Plainfield's culture of modesty, the same politeness that kept doors open and gossip contained, also allowed a deeply disturbed man to vanish in plain sight. Modern investigators examining patterns of isolated offenders often cite Gein's environment as cautionary context. Solitude itself is not dangerous. Unacknowledged solitude is. The absence of genuine connection leaves a vacuum eager to fill with fantasy. When that fantasy centers on worship or guilt, as it did for Gein, imagination stops being creative and becomes compulsory. He did not imagine evil acts out of thrill. He enacted symbols he thought were sacred. The distinction may feel academic, but it determines how experts study prevention today, recognizing obsession masked as virtue long before violence appears. Culturally, his legacy forced the public to confront morbid curiosity. Every generation discovers his name anew, often through film before fact. Yet the real story lacks cinematic rhythm. It is slow, repetitive, dominated by silence. Psychologists interpret that stillness as the sound of repression, the emotional vacuum that can breed atrocity when left unchallenged. Modern viewers who encountered him through horror movies later confronted the documents, police inventories, psychiatric reports, court transcripts showing polite handwriting and careful penmanship. The contrast between his ordinary demeanor and extraordinary deeds became the lasting fascination. Audiences were not horrified solely by what he did, but by how human he seemed while doing it. Some writers compared his pathology to a dark mirror of post-war American ideals. The vacant farm, the self-reliant bachelor, the worship of domestic order, all turned grotesque under pressure. His crimes unfolded amid an era celebrating home ownership and family purity. Within those same walls, loneliness grew unchecked. Sociologists argued that Gein represented the underside of conformity, submission so total that it consumed individuality. The result was not rebellion against social norms, but their perverse perfection. Obedience without empathy, morality without mercy. For medical historians, his case symbolized a turning point in how society approached mental illness. Before the 1950s, rural America rarely discussed psychiatric care. After Gein, Wisconsin invested in mental health training, community check-ins, and early interventions. Hospitals cited the Plainfield case whenever requesting funding for outreach programs. Officials admitted they could not have predicted his crimes, yet the embarrassment of being blindsided pushed reform faster than legislation ever could. In that sense, public shock produced progress, however grim its origins. Over the decades, observers searched for meaning in his final years at Mendota. Staff remembered him as calm, helpful, almost gentle, To some, that quiet behavior contradicted everything they had learned about evil. If monstrosity can exist without malice, what does morality even measure? The question remains central to debates in criminal psychology. Was Gein evil, or was he profoundly broken, a man who lost the capacity to know difference? The answer may lie in how we define empathy, the ability to see others as real. That ability vanished in Ed long before his crimes. Beneath every diagnosis, that simple absence explains more than any theory. Plainfield's history now sits mostly in archives, yellowed newspaper clippings, brittle photographs, court documents scanned into databases. But stories resist burial. Locals still tell newcomers fragments, always ending with the same reflection: you never really know what is going on inside a person. That sentence, banal at first, holds the entire tragedy. No matter how many films or reports reinterpret it, the core warning remains human rather than supernatural. The boundary between loneliness and danger is not drawn at the edge of sanity. It is drawn at the edge of connection. The myth of Gein will continue to live far longer than his physical remains. Each retelling risks distorting the truth, yet erasing it entirely feels irresponsible. Remembering is not glorifying. It is acknowledging what neglect and silence can allow. The horror inside that farmhouse did not grow overnight. It accumulated through years of someone being too invisible to notice. That invisibility is the real cautionary tale. In the end, Ed Gein's story reveals less about brutality than about emptiness, the vacuum left when love turns possessive and faith becomes fear. It reminds us that evil rarely descends from outside. It incubates quietly in rooms where grief goes unanswered. For Plainfield, remembering means resisting that silence. The field where his home once stood is empty now, but every frostbitten winter seems to carry an echo of footsteps returning across the snow. What remains is not legend or fright, but a reminder of how easily loneliness can masquerade as devotion until destruction feels like care. That understanding haunts because it is uncomfortably close to ordinary life. Behind every locked door exists the potential for isolation to harden into obsession, for love to twist into control. Ed Gein was one extreme outcome of a pattern that still hides in quieter forms everywhere. His life forces us to ask where compassion ends and worship begins, and whether neglect, not hatred, is the first step toward creating monsters. Was Ed Gein a monster of his own making, or one made by his world? Perhaps both. His crimes ended long ago, but the questions they raise remain alive, echoing through every story, every headline, and every uneasy silence that follows the words. He seemed so normal.